Good evening, everyone. It's my great honor to welcome you to the George Story Distinguished Lecture Series. Several people in the Department of English and in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences have come together to bring this event to us tonight. I can't go through listing them all, but I'd like to list 4 people in particular who stand out. Dr. Jennifer Lokash, who invited Kristina Bidwell and helped her in putting together her application. The Visiting Writers Committee of the Department of English, and especially Dr. Joel Deshay and Lisa Moore, who worked out all the details, ironing them out right up until the last minute. And in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, anybody who knows Chad Pelly can't thank him enough for everything he does to advertise and to keep us going and making sure that we have a nice crowd in the audience. So thank you very much to them and everybody else who came together to make this lecture series possible. Thank you. Since 1997, the George Story Distinguished Lecture Series has stimulated thought and fostered excitement for all that has to do with the humanities and social sciences. Dr. George Story joined the Department of English Language and Literature, as it was called then, in 1954, and quickly established an international international reputation as a Renaissance scholar and lexicographer. However, it was his great love and respect for this land and this province that led him to study, and indeed it can be said establish, the study of Newfoundland history, culture, literature, and language. Talk about being ahead of the times. At a time when scholars across Canada were looking at the global, George Story was looking at us. He was looking at the local and trying to find ways to collect and disseminate our local knowledge. It was this appreciation of the land and people of Newfoundland and Labrador that brought him to join people, distinguished people like William Kerwin and John Widdowson to write the most valuable dictionary of Newfoundland English, first published in 1982. As can be expected, Dr. Story received the most prestigious honors a Canadian scholar could hope for. He was Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the Royal Society of Canada. He was the recipient of the Canada Council's Molson Prize, and in 1988 was appointed a member of the Order of Canada. It is in this spirit of love for this land and its people that we would like to respectfully acknowledge it as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk. In the belief that acknowledgement can lead to reconciliation, we would like to acknowledge the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral home of the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk, and the Innu and Inuit as the original people of Labrador. Together, we strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of Newfoundland and Labrador as we search for collective healing and reconciliation. How to honor this beautiful land and all of its people, how to grow together through respectful collaboration is what Dr. Kristina Bidwell will be speaking to us about today. Her talk is a perfect way to honor the memory, the scholarship, and the vision of Dr. Story. Dr. Bidwell is expert in Indigenous storytelling in all of its rich configurations, from the personal to the communal, the public to the popular, the oral to the literary. As many of you know, she began her beautiful career right here in the Department of English at Memorial University. Indeed, it was in Bill Barker's bibliography class that she first got excited about Indigenous literature. In that class, and I love this particular story, in that class, Professor Parker asked his students to write the history of any book of their choosing. Dr. Bidwell chose to write on one of the books from her ancestor, Lydia Campbell. That book is called Sketches of a Labrador Life by a Labrador Woman. It was while writing that assignment and while thinking about what storytelling can do on a real surface, on a real level, that she found trust and belief in the type of work that she does. She then decided to focus on Indigenous literary studies during her graduate work at the University of Toronto. As you can tell, she did a pretty good job at it. From Toronto, she moved to the University of Saskatchewan, where she is a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Storytelling and full professor of English. She is spending the academic year here with us in the Department of English, and we're very thrilled to have her. Although I can go on and on about Kristina and the value of her scholarship, I will now pass the baton to Dr. Catherine Anderson, Vice President Indigenous, who will formally introduce Kristina to us. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. June, hi. Real pleasure to be here with everyone tonight. Just a quick correction, and I don't have a PhD, so no doctor, just Catherine Anderson. It's a real pleasure to be here introducing Kristina tonight. Dr. Kristina Fagan Bidwell is a member of NunatuKavut, which is a community of Inuit from Southern and Central Labrador, and she grew up here in St. John's. She's, as Dr. Pedri mentioned, a professor of Indigenous Literatures in the English department at the University of Saskatchewan. She's the editor of 2 books, Orality and Literacy, Reflections Across Disciplines, and Call Me Hank, Stolo Man's Reflections on Logging, Living, and Growing Old, as well as the author of over 25 academic articles on Indigenous literatures. Her research has focused on Indigenous storytelling and how storytelling can contribute to better understandings among peoples. In addition to her career as a teacher and researcher, she spent 7 years as the first Associate Dean of Indigenous Affairs for the College of Arts and Science at the University of Saskatchewan. She's also one of the founders and the past president of the Indigenous Literary Studies Association. She was recently appointed Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Storytelling at the University of Saskatchewan, and this year we are very delighted that she's here in St. John's with her husband and 2 sons, and is a visiting researcher at Memorial, where she's co-writing a handbook on Indigenous-led collaboration. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bidwell.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Nancy, for those very kind introductions. Thank you to the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences for inviting me to give the George Story Lecture tonight. And I want to acknowledge Sagama Misel Joe, who's chief of the hereditary chief of Mi'kmaq First Nation. Thank you for coming tonight. Okay. Atili hai. Atika, Kristina Fagan Bidwell. St. John's Miungovunga. Ilaka Nunatuha Vomiungo Tilugit. Huvia Suvungo Uvanigunagama Unapat. I want to begin this lecture in Inuktitut. What I said was, hello, my name is Kristina Fagan Bidwell. I'm from St. John's and I'm a member of NunatuKavut. I'm happy to be here this evening. Inuktitut is spoken and is being revitalized in Labrador and here in St. John's. I was fortunate to be able to take an Inuktitut course this fall, co-taught by Inuk elder Ellen Ford and linguist Douglas Warren. As an example of the kind of work that I'm going to be speaking about today, Ellen, Ama Douglas, Sulia Haliginiuk, they are collaborating. And together, bringing the language to life for students in a way that neither of them could do alone. To begin the George Story Lecture in Inuktitut seems fitting, since Story's work focused on valuing the distinctive words of this place. He led the creation of the 1982 Dictionary of Newfoundland English, a project that he wrote would see our own words, quote, subjected to a scrutiny worthy of their importance. He took Newfoundland English, which many of us at the time would have considered uneducated, backward, or funny, and treated it as valuable. In so doing, he inspired many writers and artists to use Newfoundland English in their own work. His colleague Shane O'Day put it well, he made us stop and listen to what we said, to hear what we sang, to respect ourselves, and to revere our Newfoundland as he revered it. The Dictionary of Newfoundland English was not Story's work alone, but a massive 20-year collaborative project. The editors spent several pages naming the many others who worked on it, including the thousands of students who recorded the words of their own communities. And the editors conclude that the dictionary would have been impossible to complete in the time it has taken without this shared scholarship. Those students, by the way, included my father, Michael Fagan, who recorded the words of his Irish-descended community of Riverhead, St. Mary's Bay. The Dictionary of Newfoundland English was part of what has variously been called the Newfoundland Cultural Renaissance, Revival, and even Revolution. This was a moment in the 1960s and 70s in which, as Newfoundlanders, we began to publicly claim the value of our culture. Or more precisely, I should say, that part of our culture that descended from Europe. At that time, living Indigenous peoples were not publicly considered part of the culture of this province. George Story himself seemed to recognize this blind spot in a lecture he gave to the Newfoundland Historical Society in St. John's in November 1979. Part of the project of cultural revival was documenting Newfoundland's literary history. And so Story was speaking about a narrative of a journey across the island of Newfoundland in 1922 by William Cormac, a Newfoundlander of Scottish descent. In his lecture, Story said that Cormac's writings were then being rediscovered by, quote, aspiring novelists and playwrights in search of a subject. He noted, however, that he was more interested in Sylvester Joe, the Mi'kmaq man who guided Cormac across the island. It is, Story said, quote, curiously hard to get a firm and clear portrait of Joe in Cormac's writing, which is an understatement considering how Cormac erases Joe's individuality and voice, referring to him throughout as my Indian. Story continued. If we are to have a novel or a play about the famous journey, I'd like to have it presented through the eyes of Sylvester. Adding, if I had any talents that way, I would rather write about Sylvester. Story recognized, to his credit, that Sylvester Joe's story was valuable. But like most scholars of his generation, he didn't seem to recognize that this story was not his to tell. It's been over 40 years since George Story gave that lecture. Like him, I'm standing here on a dark November night in St. John's talking about the literatures of this place. But much has changed. We now have a novel from the perspective of Sylvester Joe, my Indian, written collaboratively by Chief Mizel Joe and Sheila O'Neill and published in 2021. This novel isn't only told in Sylvester's voice, but it is written by Mi'kmaq writers and is grounded in Mi'kmaq language, culture, and lands. My Indian is part of what I will argue is a moment of Indigenous cultural renaissance in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I'm going to come back to discuss this novel in more detail later in my talk. This Indigenous cultural renaissance is, in many ways, similar to that Newfoundland cultural renaissance of 50 years ago. George Story joked in his lecture that the old Newfoundland was supposed to have disappeared, but it's still here. And as Indigenous people, we're now saying publicly that although we were supposed to have disappeared, we're very much still here. And as an Indigenous person from this place, I've been struck by how dramatically things have changed in my lifetime. My family comes from both Newfoundland and Labrador. My maternal grandmother, Margaret Campbell, was from Campbell's Cove, Labrador, and was part of a proud community of Inuit and European ancestry from southern and central Labrador. My maternal grandfather, Clarence Perry, was from Daniels Harbor on the west coast of the island. His mother, Matilda Benoit, was descended from the French and Mi'kmaq community of Bay St. George. My mother, Lenora Perry, was raised on the south coast of Labrador, where our family lived off the land, hunting, trapping, and fishing. However, faced with no options to educate their children other than sending them away to the Grenfell boarding schools, my grandparents decided to move to Daniels Harbor. It took me a long time to understand that my family's history was shaped by those residential schools, even though my mother didn't attend them. My grandmother forever after missed her beloved Labrador and told stories constantly about her family there. My mother recalls being teased by the children in Daniels Harbor about being an Eskimo from Labrador and never really feeling at home in Daniels Harbor. She left there to pursue higher education, graduate studies, and eventually a career in the Provincial Department of Education and then at Memorial, and raised me and my siblings in St. John's. I grew up always knowing that we were Indigenous. Mom told us, in the language of the time, that we were part Eskimo. And she applied for our memberships in what was then called the Labrador Métis Association back in the 80s. But I saw no connection between my Indigenous identity and what I was learning in school, where the only Indigenous people we learned about were the Beothuk, or during my English degree at Memorial University, where I was never taught a book by an Indigenous author. As a result, I didn't have the knowledge or vocabulary to describe the ways in which my family had been impacted by colonial policies, or the ways that we were nevertheless living Inuit culture in St. John's. When I come home to St. John's now, I see that so much has changed for the better. I see contemporary Indigenous people playing central roles in many public events. At Memorial, there are now Indigenous leaders and Indigenous faculty members. Juniper House is a highly visible statement of Indigenous student presence on campus. First Light, the local friendship center, is a vibrant and rapidly growing part of the city's cultural life. This very week, the Spirit Song Festival of Indigenous Arts and Culture is happening all over the city. Even my giving this lecture is a sign of this change. When I finished my English degree at Memorial in the 90s, there were no faculty teaching or supervising in Indigenous literature. And so I had to leave the province to pursue my graduate studies and my career in that field. And so it feels very meaningful to me to be invited here today to speak about the power and potential of Indigenous literature here at home in Newfoundland and Labrador. What I'll argue in this talk is that Indigenous storytelling must play a central role in this moment of Indigenous cultural renaissance. By storytelling, I mean all the ways that we tell stories, orally, in literature, in film, in song, in all kinds of media. And more specifically, I'll argue for the role that literary collaboration has played and can play in amplifying Indigenous voices, and in so doing, challenging the dominant story that has been told about Indigenous people in Newfoundland and Labrador, which I call a story of Indigenous absence. Before getting into collaboration, I want to step back a bit and talk about this story of Indigenous absence which has been told in this province for a long time. According to this story, Indigenous people are in danger of disappearing, are in the process of disappearing, or are already gone, either through being assimilated or by dying out. And this was the story I was taught here in the 1980s. And it has persisted. Jocelyn Thorpe, a scholar of women's studies, remembers that when she moved from Vancouver to St. John's in 2010, there were, quote, 2 things I thought I knew for sure about Newfoundland. 1, there are no more codfish. 2, there are no more Indigenous people. Now, this narrative of Indigenous absence isn't unique to Newfoundland. It has been told across the colonial world, and it has been used over and over again as a justification for appropriation. If Indigenous people are disappearing or gone, then it is assumed that one is justified in taking over their voice or taking over their land. In this province, as has been argued persuasively by Fiona Pollock and the authors in the recent anthology Tracing Ochre, Changing Perspectives on the Beothuk, the widespread public mourning of the Beothuk has also functioned as part of this story of absence by obscuring the ongoing existence of other Indigenous peoples in Newfoundland and Labrador. Indeed, the narrative of absence has been pervasive in historical descriptions of every Indigenous people here in the province. And I'll give just a few of countless examples. Charles Halleck, a journalist, wrote in Harper's Magazine in 1866 about the Inuit in what is now NunatuKavut in central and northern Labrador. He said, "They are rapidly diminishing, so rapidly that it is easy to mark within a generation their rapid progress towards extinction." About the Inuit of southern Labrador, American geologist A.S. Packard wrote in 1860, "Before another century has passed, the few stragglers living upon this coast will be chiefly interesting to the student of mankind as relics of a semi-fossil people who figure largely in books on prehistoric times." About the Innu. In 1863, geologist Henry Hind Ewell reported, "With the pure Indian, it is not his nature to till. And the chances are this tribe, which is very remarkable in having retained their purity of Indian blood and savage indolence of the desert, will never till the soil and will gradually become extinct." And in 1902, J.P. Howley, director of the Newfoundland Geological Survey, wrote, "I believe the Micmac's day in Newfoundland is all but over. I do not believe there are 100 in existence here now." This story of Indigenous absence, which was stated as fact by so many published and respected authorities, shaped how political leaders thought, in both Newfoundland and Canada, thought about, or more precisely did not think about, Indigenous people as they negotiated the terms under which Newfoundland and Labrador would join Canada in Confederation. And so, in 1949, Newfoundland and Canada agreed there would be no recognition of Indigenous people in the new province. This moment of public erasure has made the history of Indigenous people in Newfoundland and Labrador unique within Canada. Indigenous people in this province have been fighting for government recognition of our presence ever since, and it has been a long and ongoing process. Meowpukek, or Con River, became a federally recognized Mi'kmaq reserve in 1987. The Innu Nation became status Indians under the federal government in 2002. NunatuKavut settled their land claim in 2005. Qalipu First Nation was first recognized by the federal government in 2008. NunatuKavut entered into an MOU with the federal government to negotiate nation to nation in 2019. But despite these gains in political recognition, the legacy of our erasure at Confederation and the ongoing story of Indigenous absence continues to impact us as Indigenous people by creating fractures within and between us, disconnecting us from ourselves and from one another. Psychologists have shown the ways in which society's dominant narratives are internalized into our personal identities, making it difficult to value and articulate personal experiences that don't fit into those narratives. Through this process of internalization, the narrative of absence can seep into us as Indigenous people, creating shame, self-doubt, and a sense of not being Indigenous enough. The narrative of absence can also creep into how we see each other, so that even as Indigenous people, we sometimes perceive other Indigenous people in terms of deficiency, lack, and absence, rather than in terms of relatedness and solidarity. In this way, the story of Indigenous absence fractures our relationships with one another. The story of our absence also continues to influence how we're perceived by the wider public, including by people from outside the province. The unique history of Indigenous people here isn't well understood outside the province, and in many ways doesn't have the markers that Canadians have learned to associate with Indigenous history. Culturally, too, the images that many Canadians associate with indigeneity come from Western and Central Canada. And so Indigenous people in Newfoundland and Labrador are often simply not visible or legible to other Canadians and aren't included in public discussions of Indigenous peoples. One effect of this is to fracture us from Indigenous people in the rest of Canada. As just one telling example, if we look at Métis scholar Chelsea Vowell's best-selling and widely taught book, Indigenous Rights, A Guide to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Issues in Canada, it contains no mention of Newfoundland and one of Labrador. And the mass media often doesn't help. For example, Mi'kmaq scholar Caitlin Hanrahan analyzed print news stories about the Qalipu First Nation and found a prevalent assumption that Newfoundlanders are, quote, becoming Indian only in order to get financial benefits. And these are examples of the narrative of absence in contemporary form. Through all of this, to be clear, we have kept insisting on our presence. Despite all efforts to the contrary, we're still here on our lands and telling our stories. I'd like here to quote Cherokee literary scholar Daniel Heath Justice from his book, Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, because I think his words resonate in our context. According to the settler stories of Indigenous deficiency, our people were supposed to vanish into the sunset long ago. Our family's stubborn refusal to disappear has vexed and perplexed colonial apologists for centuries. 4, our people are still here, as are our relations, as are our stories. In fact, our stories have been integral to that survival. More than that, they've been part of our cultural, political, and familial resurgence and our continuing efforts to maintain our rights and responsibilities in these contested lands. They are good medicine. They remind us of who we are and where we're going. In short, they matter. Indigenous stories in Newfoundland and Labrador matter because they counteract and replace the story of our absence with the story of our presence. They matter because they give us a way of understanding ourselves and each other outside of the limited framework of government recognition. I want to recognize here that our stories can take many forms. Stories told around the kitchen table, on the land, or to our children are just as important as any published book. But we also do have books. There are powerful contemporary Indigenous writers from this province, such as Mi'kmaq writers Megan Cole and Douglas Walborn Goff, such as Innu writers Elizabeth Panashaway and Christine Poker, And there's an established Labrador Inuit literary tradition that has been published by Them Days magazine for 50 years. However, the fracturing forces of the narrative of Indigenous absence, politically, psychologically, and in terms of public perception, all these have compromised our ability to make our stories widely heard. While books by Indigenous writers from elsewhere in Canada have been topping the national bestseller lists, we haven't seen that kind of readership and recognition for Indigenous writers from here yet. And despite groundbreaking work by local literary scholars such as Robin McGraw, Roberta Buchanan, Vicki Hallett, Valerie Legg, and Morgan Mills, the study of Indigenous literatures from Newfoundland and Labrador is still at a very small scale. And so, at this moment of Indigenous cultural renaissance, I see a great opportunity to amplify Indigenous voices from Newfoundland and Labrador, to see them more written, more published, more read, more taught, and more studied. And this brings me back to collaboration. In describing the effects of the story of Indigenous absence, I've used the term fracture because it doesn't imply permanent loss, right? That which has been fractured can be put back together. In Pam Hall and Jerry Evans' recent collaborative book, Mi'kmaq, the Middle River, they write about wanting to include in their book an image of Eva John Roberts' traditional Mi'kmaq women's peaked cap. But the cap had been lost, and they couldn't locate it anywhere. So, they explain, they commissioned Eva to make the cap again. Their collaboration with Eva provided her with the time, resources, and encouragement to engage in this time-consuming project. I love this story because it speaks to the way that our knowledge and creations aren't lost, but sometimes they need to be remade or put back together. And collaboration can help us do this. While I use the word collaboration, I do want to acknowledge that this is a word that carries a heavy burden, both historical and institutional. There is a long history, deeply rooted in colonialism, of non-Indigenous scholars working with Indigenous people in ways that primarily benefit the scholar, but that haven't benefited or have even harmed Indigenous communities. To try to change this colonial legacy, institutions such as universities and granting agencies have created many policies and regulations around Indigenous collaborations. For example, Memorial University has a new policy that states that the ethical and respectful conduct of research that impacts Indigenous people requires collaboration and lays out the formal agreements that are required before engaging in such collaboration. While such institutional requirements are a good and important start, they're also limited. They're based in institutional language and ways of knowing, relying on legalistic agreements and processes and institutionally defined roles and forms of authority. And while they help prevent unethical research, such policies provide little guidance as to how to achieve a mutually meaningful, beneficial, and enjoyable collaboration. So, with my colleague Sophie McCall, a settler literary scholar from Simon Fraser University, I'm engaged in a research project that explores the diverse forms of Indigenous collaboration in the literary arts. And that will provide some guidance to those wishing to engage in such collaborations. With funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, we've been interviewing writers, scholars, and elders who have extensive experience with Indigenous collaboration. In the summer of 2022, we gathered in Saskatchewan with some of our interviewees to collectively develop a list of best practices in collaboration. What we heard loud and clear from the elders at that gathering was that we need to start with Indigenous models of collaboration based in the specific languages, places, and cultures of Indigenous peoples. One of those elders at our event was Métis writer Maria Campbell. At one point, Maria was sitting at a table with 3 younger Indigenous women, including myself. Unlike Maria, who was a fluent Cree speaker, the 3 of us had not grown up with our Indigenous languages. And so we wondered how we could learn the teachings about collaboration found in those languages. Maria reassured us, saying, "Look at what you do know, what you do have. Start with one word. We all have a piece of the puzzle." I've reflected on Maria's teaching many times since then. It was her teaching that inspired me to take an NunatuKavut course this fall. And it has inspired me to think a lot more about Indigenous collaboration here at home in Newfoundland and Labrador. What do we have? What do we know? What are our ways of collaborating? How can we put together our pieces of the puzzle? And so I've begun talking to people engaged in Indigenous collaborations here at home. And one thing that has emerged from these collaborations is that while in English, collaboration is an abstract noun, Indigenous cultures emphasize an essential physicality in establishing and maintaining collaborative relationships. You need ample health, space, security, energy, family support, childcare, food, money, and actual physical time together in order to carry out collaborative work. We can see the physicality of collaboration powerfully expressed in Innu elder Elizabeth Panashaway's project of inviting people to walk with her across Innu lands. In her memoir, I Keep the Land Alive, edited and translated in collaboration with settler scholar Elizabeth Yeoman, Panashaway includes the record from her diary of when she first had the idea for the walk. In March 1998, she wrote, "I went outside to get firewood and hang clothes on the line. While I was doing that, enjoying the good weather, a wonderful idea came to me. We could go to NunatuKavut this spring on foot instead of by helicopter or bush plane. That's how our people used to travel when they went to NunatuKavut. It would be so wonderful if we could do it and find people to help us. I want to ask my husband about it when he comes home from work." This moment of inspiration, which came partly from being outside, was also immediately a moment of collaboration. Panashaway knows that she must talk to her husband and seek others' help. This moment led to Panashaway's annual walk, in which people from many nations have participated and which is a powerful statement of contemporary Innu presence on their lands. Yeoman, Panashaway's collaborator, expands on the significance of walking in her book, Exactly What I Said, Translating Words and Worlds. She explores how walking can be a way of connecting with the land, with our bodies, with our thoughts, and with each other. Walking together can be a form of and a model for collaboration. I'm now going to discuss 3 examples of Indigenous-led collaborative storytelling. My first example is Mi'kmaq poet Shannon Webb Campbell's poetry collection, I Am a Body of Land, which illustrates how collaboration can help repair fractured relationships. In an interview with the CBC, Webb Campbell described how her connections to her Mi'kmaq community have been fractured. "My community is Newfoundland. I come from the west coast of Newfoundland. I didn't grow up there, and that's where my father's family is from. I didn't have the ties and the relationships to my family in the way I probably needed to. That's been a huge absence in my understanding of my indigeneity." You may have heard about Shannon Webb Campbell on the news a few years ago when her writing became the subject of controversy. Her 2018 collection, Who Took My Sister, explored cases of murdered Indigenous women, including that of Loretta Saunders, a Labrador Inuit woman who was murdered while attending university in Nova Scotia. Who Took My Sister was intended to express solidarity with those murdered women, and to do so, Webb Campbell sometimes wrote in their voices. But she did so without reaching out to the families of those women, a move that she now describes as a mistake, a lack of collaboration, and a breach of Indigenous protocol. After the collection was released, Loretta Saunders' sibling, Diem Saunders, expressed how disturbed they were by the poem about their sister, writing in a blog post, "I'm unsure if she consciously decided to not reach out to my family because she knew no family would agree to having their loved one written about in such gory detail, or if she is just that out of touch with the protocols that exist in our Indigenous communities." Alongside that blog post, Saunders put a photo from Walking with Our Sisters, an art project led by Métis artist Christy Belcourt, in which contributors created almost 2,000 pairs of moccasin vamps in honor of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And this image acted as a counterpoint to Webb Campbell's lack of collaboration. Who Took My Sister exemplifies how easily acts of intended solidarity and sympathy can become appropriation. Webb Campbell has written about how alone she felt when she realized her mistake, imagining voices saying to her, "You are alone in this. No one will stand with you." But this isn't the end of the story. Webb Campbell's publisher pulled Who Took My Sister from the shelves, but then they also reached out to Stalo and Métis writer and elder Lee Maracle. Maracle agreed to collaborate with Webb Campbell to revise her collection of poetry. And when I spoke to Shannon, she told me that when she first talked to Maracle, Maracle asked her why she hadn't reached out and asked for her help earlier, before the book came out. In thinking about that question, Webb Campbell explained to me that her own sense of disconnection prevented her from reaching out. She said, "There's this perception that some people are inaccessible when they're not." What I got out of that time with Lee, and even with the community in Newfoundland when I was thrown back there in a rough moment, was like, how come you didn't ask us? And what I see now is, it's better to ask. Lee Maracle and Webb Campbell sat together on Maracle's porch and went through the poems line by line. Shannon told me that the act of being physically together in Maracle's home was essential to their sense of connection, as Maracle pushed her to speak authentically from her own voice, from her own experience. Maracle also told Webb Campbell that she needed to connect back home. Webb Campbell recounted, "So I called Elder Cal White, and Cal said to me, 'Shannon Webb, I have been waiting for you to call for years.'" Webb Campbell also reached out to apologize to the families of the women she had written about. And ultimately, her book was republished as I Am a Body of Land. Looking back over this learning process, Webb Campbell says, "I feel like I collaborate with everything I do now." And indeed, her more recent work involves other writers, artists, and musicians. As just one example of her work, let's look at her poem, Letter to Joseph R. Smallwood, which was inspired by Alberta Métis writer Marilyn Dumont's letter to Sir John A. Macdonald. So Webb Campbell's poem starts, "Dear Joey, I'm still here and mixed Mi'kmaq after all these years. You're long dead, yet Confederation couldn't stop Newfoundland's ongoing colonial violence. You continued so unapologetically, telling Ottawa there are no red Indians. Nancy April, we killed them all. And you know, Joey, after all your declarations, bowing to the settlers, we are still here." Shannon Webb Campbell recalls how Lee Maracle told her that before she could publish this poem, she needed to call Marilyn Dumont and ask her for permission, which she did. a connection that she said has led to a further relationship. And so with this poem, we see how collaborations with Indigenous people from outside Newfoundland have made possible this strong statement of presence in Newfoundland. Miracle spoke about this process, explaining that she was happy, as she put it, to help lead Shannon home. We're disconnected from our indigeneity by the deliberate will of the Canadian state. So we're fractured people from within and without, and we're busy putting ourselves back together. As my second example, I now want to turn back to My Indian by Mizelle Joe and Sheila O'Neill. As I mentioned earlier, this novel retells Cormac's trek across the island in search of the Beothuk through the eyes of Sylvester Joe. In the novel, Joe does not want to help with Cormac's venture, fearing it will cause further harm to the Beothuk. And so he decides, on the advice of his elders, to guide Cormac with the secret intention of keeping him away from the Beothuk people. While we could talk much more about the relationship between Cormac and Joe, some aspects of which were collaborative, I want to focus more on the ways that the novel My Indian seeks to reflect and rebuild collaborations and relationships between Indigenous people. Many of us in Newfoundland grew up being taught the false story that the Mi'kmaq were brought to the island as mercenaries to kill the Beothuk. A false history. So this novel counters that narrative by depicting the Beothuk people's historical relationship with the Mi'kmaq people's historical relationship with the Beothuk, including how a moment of disagreement and violence led to the distancing of the two peoples. My Indian seeks to repair that moment of fracturing by depicting Joe's journey as an effort to collaborate with the Beothuk. Seeing Beothuk footprints near their camp and knowing that they are hiding nearby, Joe steers Cormac clear of the Beothuk camps. Also, during his journey, Joe encounters other Mi'kmaq and Innu people who help him and Cormac, feed them, give them shelter, make maps for them, walk with them, exchange gifts with them. They work with Joe to make sure that Cormac doesn't find the Beothuk. Joe is only able to complete his journey with the collaboration of these many other Indigenous friends and family. My Indian also brings Beothuk and Mi'kmaq collaboration into the present day by including at the end of the book an account of Chief Joe's repatriation of Beothuk remains from Scotland back to England. Chief Joe describes the powerful experience of physically being with the Beothuk remains and touching them. He said, "My vision of the room went blank. I had no vision of anybody else in the room or the room itself. I had a deep, deep sense of sorrow. That sorrow wasn't there when the remains were returned to Newfoundland and Labrador. I was happy. Maybe it was a different kind of happy since they were home." Through this emotional and physical connection with the Beothuk, and through a sense of collaboration in bringing them back home, the repatriation is a story of Indigenous relationship that counters the fracturing story of the Mi'kmaq as mercenaries. This sense of a physical and emotional collaboration between Indigenous people is also reflected in Mizelle Joe and Sheila O'Neill's own collaboration that they did to create this novel. Chief Joe brought the stories and the history, while O'Neill brought the writing skills to make the story more widely accessible. Their work together was often physical, as they drank tea together at the chief's house or went out on the land to see the kinds of animals and places that Sylvester would have seen, or went on walks together. When I spoke to the authors, Sheila O'Neill explained that this collaborative process was part of her journey of repairing the fractures in her own self-understanding. So she said, our Mi'kmaq identity was hidden. It was shameful. And my sister and I were walking recently together and we were saying, you know, we really did grow up as Mi'kmaq without being told we were Mi'kmaq, in the way that my dad always looked out to the elders in the community, hunting and sharing and fishing and living off the land and family and sharing. So without it being said, it was part of our existence. And it was like, oh, okay, it has a name that nobody's been talking about. And then I went through a period in my life where I wouldn't identify because I didn't want to be seen as having any kind of unfair advantage. And you work your way through that. So for my personal journey, to be here as a published storyteller and honored to work with Chief Joe on this, it's huge. So far, I've spoken about fairly small and intimate literary collaborations. As my third and final example, I want to speak briefly about a larger collaborative project of Indigenous storytelling. The documentary Heard, Inuit Voices on Caribou, is described as a community-led, research-based documentary film. While directed and produced by settler filmmaker David Borish, the film's creation was led by a steering committee comprised of Inuit community members, representatives from both NunatuKavut and NunatuKavut governments, the Torngat Secretariat, and university researchers. The documentary tells the story of the decline of the George River caribou and the total ban on caribou hunting in Labrador, tracing the impact of this change on Inuit lives. To tell this story, the documentary doesn't have a voiceover narrative. It's told entirely by putting together Inuit voices. The film begins with a series of clips of interviewees struggling individually to articulate how important the caribou are to them. It's as if each one of them can't on their own express the significance of the caribou to their people. The film puts the story together by drawing on many voices to articulate the intimate and multi-layered relationship between the Inuit and caribou. Part of that story is that the caribou hunts themselves were highly collaborative, creating relationships between Inuit people all up and down the coast, with hunters working together across current political boundaries. So I'm going to play a clip where some hunters talk about that hunting together.
I think one of the biggest impacts of the loss of caribou to the south coast is you're not going from community to community so much as you used to one time. One time when there was a hunt on, you didn't necessarily just hunt, take 2 or 3 men from your own community and go. You probably had people come from other communities, like 10 or 12 men go together from different communities and have a shared hunt and harvest and bring it home to the communities. Right now you haven't got that because we haven't got a hunt, and if it ever comes back, I think you'll see the same thing happen again. You'll see, because families are spread out over different communities, you'll see different family members getting together and going out on hunts again.
It was a tradition almost to go at that time, you know. We used to leave here and go to Gooseray. Next day we went up to church, and then leave here and we go to Cartwright. Next day we went to Covey. So it was a long haul and a cold haul, and you go meet people down there, right?
Going into other communities and socializing and sharing and helping each other. That's just not there anymore. You travel to Nain or you travel to Nunavik. You travel to Labrador West, inside of Goose Bay, Border Beacon, inside of Nutawashish. You go to Nutawashish, you go to Davis Inlet, McCovic, Postville, Hopedale. People came here to harvest caribou. That was that social aspect of it. It was a part of who we were. So it not only played a significant role for filling bellies, there was that social, respectful aspect of that, of the hunt.
So, in the spirit of that social, respectful aspect of the hunt, while the film acknowledges the Inuit contributors as part of NunatuKavut or NunatuKavut, it doesn't make distinctions between the ways that these two related groups relate to the caribou or to each other. If we look to practices such as the caribou hunt and walking the land together, we can draw on these Indigenous models of collaboration to shape our work as researchers, writers, and storytellers. And by starting with these models and telling our stories together, Indigenous-led collaborations can help us resist the story of Indigenous absence and knit together the fractures within and between us. Together, we can tell a more powerful story of Indigenous presence than any one of us can alone. We all have a piece of the puzzle. While I've discussed some amazing examples of Indigenous-led collaboration in Newfoundland and Labrador, there's also so much potential for more of these kinds of collaborations. According to the census, Indigenous people make up about 10% of the population of this province. St. John's is the city with the highest rate of Indigenous population growth in all of Canada. So there are so many opportunities for us to work together. You'll remember that at the beginning, I talked about how George Story was recovering Newfoundland's literary history by digging up early writers like Cormac. In the same way, we still have a lot of work to do to understand the history of Indigenous storytelling in this province. Who are our Indigenous literary ancestors? And when it comes to teaching, how can we support teachers in bringing local and contemporary Indigenous stories into their school and university classrooms? How can we meaningfully and substantially bring Indigenous storytellers, elders, and knowledge keepers into our literature classrooms? And we also need to look towards the future, towards ways to encourage more Indigenous people here to tell and write their own stories. How can Indigenous mentorship and collaboration encourage Indigenous storytelling? How might we leverage our vibrant writing community in this province to encourage more Indigenous writing? What if we were to connect Indigenous writers from other parts of Canada with aspiring Indigenous writers here? And finally, remembering what I said about the physicality of collaboration, how can we create the resources in terms of space, time, energy, and money for these ambitious projects to happen? Sulia haligini yaka vugut. We have to collaborate. So I want to give the final word to Chief Mizell Joe. When I spoke with him, he said, I encourage more and more Aboriginal people to get involved and to write about their own history from their own perspective and write about real things that happen in this day and age. They don't always have to be about things that happened 200 years ago. There's struggles in this world right now, in our own community, that we need to be writing about as well. We need to be writing about the failures and the successes and the education and all the things that are going on in our communities. So I think it's important that more and more Indigenous people start to take up that pen. So I just want to say thank you to all the many people who worked with me on this research, and some of them are in this room, this lecture, and I want to thank all of you for your attention tonight. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristina, for your great lecture and for giving us a lot of food for thought. I'd like to now open up the floor for any questions that you may have.
Questions, suggestions, corrections, anything.
Okay, I can begin. I wondered, you spoke a lot about collaboration, Indigenous-led collaboration. I wondered if it gives rise to different storytelling forms as well as stories that need to be told.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that yes, that trying to bring different voices together, trying to think about how do you put different voices together without one covering over or appropriating the other, does lead to new forms. Actually, right now, myself and my collaborator, who I mentioned, Sophie McCall, are working on a book and a book on collaboration. And so we've been asking the people we've been working with to write pieces that we can include in the book. And we want to include pieces of the interviews, and we want to include pieces of, because we want to keep that that collaboration open with a lot, and not just have it be just our voice. But actually that's very hard to do. Like we're really struggling with, okay, how do we organize this, right? How do we put together multiple voices in a way that it's still coherent, and so I think it does lead to, experimentation with different forms, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Any? I can continue.
Telling a story.
Go ahead.
In 1985, the Assembly of First Nations came to Newfoundland for the first time. All the chiefs from across Canada coming to St. John's.
Yes, may I invite you up to speak? I'm going to run and get a mic so that everybody can hear you.
Okay.
I was trying to
Yeah,
gesticulate, but it didn't work very well. I need a new form. Thank you. Talking stick.
Talking stick. The talking mic. Is it on? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, in 1985, we was asked by the Assembly of First Nations to come to St. John's and to look at the hotels and see if it was suitable for the Assembly of First Nations to have a big meeting. It was called the National Indian Brotherhood, chiefs from all across Canada. And because we were the host province, we was asked to come to St. John's and do all of that and report back to the national chief. And on the way home, I was thinking, what a sin that we have to drive here and welcome all those dignitaries to our province. And by the time I got home, I had formed a plan that I'm not going to drive, I'm going to walk. And I convinced my brother, my younger brother and a friend of ours, that it would be a good trip to make, and we would follow the old traditional route from Maui-Bugik to Con River that Sylvester Joe had taken. And we decided that we never had no maps or compass or GPS back then. We decided that we would go and live off the land, sleep under the stars, and 33 days later, the day that the assembly opened up, we walked into the assembly, which is now the Sheraton, but it's the Newfoundland Hotel then, and I greeted the chiefs from across Canada. The older chiefs understood what we did, but the younger people not so much. But we smelt bad, looked bad, but we made it. That's my story.
Oh.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful story. Yet another story of sort of a really important walk, right? That walking on the land being that statement of presence, right? Like, yeah. Thank you for sharing that story.
Thank you. Joel, did you have your hand up? Okay, I'm going to reach.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Fagan Bidwell, for being here for this fantastic talk and for sharing all of this with us. I'm very grateful that you were able to come and speak with us in this way. Right now I'm teaching a literature course that it involves the 1970 novel Hunter with Harpoon by Marcusi Patsauk. And it's about intercultural intra-cultural communication and collaboration in the north, the far north. And that got me thinking when I was listening to you about the history and historicization of collaboration amongst Indigenous communities. When we saw the film clip from the Heard film, everybody's driving around on snowmobiles and in trucks. So it's, it's the contemporary moment of relatively easy transportation and communication. So how modern or contemporary or recent is the kind of collaboration that you have in mind? And are there ways in which it's importantly not modern or contemporary, where you're tapping into other traditions? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I was trying to speak to is the ways that Indigenous people have always collaborated, worked together on various things. Maria Campbell, who I spoke about, she has worked collaboratively on a lot of different projects, mostly with Indigenous women. But she said her first collaboration was with her great-grandmother, because she was raised in part by her great-grandmother and just being taught to work alongside, And so I think that and another person who was at that workshop that I showed the picture from was a Stalo elder, Sonny McKelsey, who said that in his community, there is a rule that if someone dies from your family, you have to get someone else to dig the grave. It's tradition. Someone from your own family cannot dig the grave because you're too close, you might cry into the grave, and there's a belief that that could cause harm. Or he told me that if you're planning to have a potlatch, that you have to get someone from outside your family to be the speaker, because you're considered to be too close to the to the situation, I suppose, and you need someone from the outside to help you. And so I think that, there's these traditional forms of collaboration that can teach us a lot and that we can reflect on as having teachings for us as we do more contemporary. It's not that we have to stay the same, right? But that we can maybe think about, what can those things teach us about how to do collaboration now. I think that sometimes we get in the university, we're too much sort of in our heads and we think it's all kind of a mental process or something, right? But I think that, we need to, what these traditions teach us is that, it's physical and it's emotional and it's relational, right? And it takes time and it takes work. So yeah, I hope that helps.
I have a puzzle question. As an avid puzzle maker, there's sometimes when pieces just go missing. And I wonder if there's any way that collaboration and collaboratively led projects can find better ways to nod towards the missing pieces, to give those empty spaces meaning, to make them speak through silence even.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting question, because I think that, I said things are not lost. Things can be remade, things can be rebuilt. And I really do believe that, but I think sometimes maybe, we do have to accept. Actually, Black writers have written a lot about this, African-American writers, that there's things that have been lost, that are not known, that cannot be recovered, right? And that is just the truth, and and I think it's interesting. It's a very interesting question. How can collaboration attend to that, right? Yeah. I don't know. I would have to think about that more. I was at the launch for Jerry Evans and Pam Hall's book when? Yesterday, the day before yesterday, and they were speaking about how in the Mi'kmaq community, some things in Newfoundland had been entirely lost, and there's been a process of bringing in Mi'kmaq people from off the island to help relearn some of those things, and Pam said, I thought it was very moving. She said, do you value something more because you've never lost it? Or do you value it more when you've lost it and then you found it again, right? And I have a puzzle sitting on my dining room table right now with one missing piece, and I just can't give up, because I'm sure I'm going to find that missing piece somewhere. But it's a very interesting question, though. You're right. Sometimes I'm not going to find that puzzle piece, and
all the pieces that are there announce the missing piece, and therefore it's there even in its absence, right?
Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any? Oh, Lisa. Oh, she's far away.
Thank you, Kristina. That was an amazing talk, really eye-opening. I wanted to ask you what you were talking about when going across Canada and talking about, the particular history of Newfoundland here with Joey Smallwood's edict. And my impression is that people aren't aware of that history.
Outside of Newfoundland, you
Outside of Newfoundland. And so I'm just wondering if when you speak about it, which I guess you do, how do people respond to it? Is it a shock? Do they see the kind of erasure that might be different from other Indigenous communities across Canada, or?
Yeah, this is part of the reason I wanted to, I got thinking about this, because I teach Indigenous literatures in Saskatchewan, and so I spend a lot of time talking to people out there about Indigenous issues, and I really find that there is no knowledge, even among really educated, well-informed people, Indigenous people, there's really no understanding of the history of Newfoundland and Labrador, not even any just beginning awareness, right? And so I think that's part of, and I think then people see news stories, the kinds that I mentioned about the Halibut First Nation and things like that, and they think, oh, what is this? This is some kind of, that they have misperceptions because they don't have any background knowledge. And, the media often, the news doesn't provide a lot of background in their stories, right? And so I think it really contributes to a lot of really negative misconceptions and the feeling that, people out here are not real, or, things like that. So I guess part of what I think is that part of what I'm talking about here is maybe there's ways to create collaborations that actually create collaborations within the province, but also to create collaborations that work across, with maybe other Indigenous peoples or other institutions in other places, to begin to create some more awareness, because I think it's very much needed.
Dark day. I'd like to invite everyone to mingle a little bit and carry the conversation onward into a nice casual setting. Thank you, Kristina, once again for sharing.
Thank you.